Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about some concepts from Chapter 11 of Maxfield and Babbie. Chapter 11 is all about field research. Field research can be very interesting and also dangerous, depending on what it is that you're studying. It can also present a lot of unique ethical challenges that we don't necessarily see in other modes of research. Field research is basically just observation. It's literally going out into the field and observing something or some activity that you're interested in studying. It's good for studying topics where you learn the most by just actually going out and observing um, that activity. The book has a really interesting example here about a researcher who was interested in studying club drugs like ecstasy and how they're used in social settings. And so she actually went to a number of different clubs and bars and watched as people used ecstasy and watched how they behaved. And she wrote up her observations. And then this turned into, I believe, her dissertation research. So, an interesting approach to understanding how people use club drugs. Certainly, you can get some of this information maybe by surveying people, but I think her approach was very novel and unique, and probably, frankly, the best way to get information on this topic because she was actually in the field seeing how people use these drugs and and how they interacted with each other. So, just a very interesting example of field research and how you can use it to gain information that you may not be able to get through other means. I've been involved in several projects myself that have used field research as a part of the project. For example, a few years ago, I was involved in a study in Winter Park, Florida, and we were looking at residential burglary and trying to understand factors that led to residential burglary in Winter Park. And so I actually went to locations in Winter Park where there had been residential or commercial burglaries. And then I noted characteristics of those locations that might be preceptors to burglary. So I looked at the amount of activity on the street, pedestrians and vehicles. I looked at the street layout. I looked at lighting. I looked at fences. Um, and basically came up with some suggestions for prevention because we were trying to figure out some ways that burglary could be prevented. But in order to do that, we had to develop a better understanding of why some of these locations were so susceptible to burglary in the first place. So, field research was a very good way to develop that understanding. So, in doing field research, one of the key decisions that the researcher has to make is what role they're going to assume in doing the research. And there's three basic roles that a researcher can assume. They can either be a full participant, an observer as participant, or a complete observer. And I'm just going to talk briefly about these roles and what they are and give you some examples. So, a full participant, this is when the researcher actually gets involved in whatever it is that they're studying, and they typically do not disclose to people in that setting that they're a researcher. A very interesting and controversial example of this is Eric Good's research in the 1960s. Eric Good was a sociologist who was interested in studying the hippie culture. And so he actually joined a hippie commune himself. He didn't tell people that he was a researcher and that he was doing this study. He just joined the commune and then later wrote about his experiences. The problem is that Good admitted in his own writings that during his time at the hippie commune that he had sex with people and that he also used drugs such as marijuana and LSD. And so when he wrote about this, people in the research community just blasted him and just said, one, this is really unethical because he wasn't honest about why he was there and what he was doing. And then also, they said that he really just did this for himself and that basically he wanted to have sex and use drugs and he used research as an excuse to engage in these activities. But Good fired back, and he argued that this was really the best way to study hippies in their natural environment. And he said that had he gone in there and said that he was a researcher and that he was conducting observations, that people would clam up, that they would change their behavior, that they would not act the way that they normally would because they knew they were being watched. And this is a concept called reactivity. And it's just the idea that when people know they're being observed, they're going to change their behavior somewhat. And so Good said that the only way to do the study was to take a full participant role, and that got around the issue of reactivity. So on those grounds, he argued that the study was sound and was ethical. I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think. I don't know that there's really a consensus one way or another, but that's what he said. But you can see an example here of full participation and some of the ethical questions that come up with that. The second role is the observer as participant, and this is where the researcher is there, but they identify to people that they are researcher and they are conducting research. A good example of this would be ride-alongs with the police. So I have done some ride-alongs with the police where I was literally there with them during their patrol shifts, and I was just sitting in the passenger seat of the car and just watching and writing down my observations. The officers that I was with, they knew who I was. They knew I was a researcher. They talked to me. I got to ask them questions. But again, I wasn't a full participant. I was just observing, and they knew that I was there for a research purpose. And sometimes some interesting things can happen when you engage in this kind of research. For example, there was one time that I was doing a ride along, and the officer actually arrested a guy for shoplifting, and he put the guy in the back seat of the car, and I'm just sitting there in the front seat, and the officer went off to, I guess, talk with a witness or something, and so I'm sitting there in the front seat. This guy's in the back seat handcuffed, and he was really upset, and he started banging his head on the plexiglass divider that divides the back seat and the front seat, and I'm just kind of sitting there like, okay, what do I do here? So you see some interesting things when you engage in field research. The final role is the complete observer, and this is somebody that just observes a location, but they don't become a part of it in any way. And this is very much what I did in Winter Park. So when I went to these locations where there had been burglaries, I just observed the activities on the street and I just wrote up what I saw. But I didn't talk to anybody, I didn't ask anybody any questions. I did have people come up to me and ask me what I was doing there, and then, I would explain to them that I was doing research, but I didn't actively participate in any activities. I just observed. So, some other things that we can discuss with respect to field research. How do you record your observations in the field? There's three basic ways that you can record your observations. You can do video recording, audio recording, and you can also take still photos. Obviously, these methods are a lot easier now than they used to be because, I mean, everybody's phones have some sort of video, photo, or audio recording capabilities. There's an interesting example in the book of using video. George Kelling was interested in studying the interactions between panhandlers and citizens in New York, and specifically the squeegee people. So, if you've ever seen that in New York or maybe in other large cities, you see it sometimes where there'll be a homeless person on a street corner, and they'll walk up to your car when you're waiting at a traffic light, and they'll have a squeegee and a bucket, and they'll start cleaning your windows without you asking, and the idea is that then you have to tip them. So George Kelling was really interested in this, and so he actually videotaped interactions between these squeegee people and motorists in New York. So that was a really interesting study and a unique example of video to actually record those interactions. Um, Still photos are used quite a bit as well. When I was doing the Winter Park study, I took a lot of photos of street conditions and graffiti and other factors. And these photos were good to just provide context for what was really going on. And I was also able to include some of them in my final report. And there's audio recording. This is good for interviews if you interview anyone in the field. And also in those situations where you may not be able to write down what it is that you're observing, and you may have to take some notes. For example, I worked on a project a few years ago where I was looking at speeding in residential areas and also on highway on ramps. And so I conducted this study by actually going out and driving these roads myself and observing other motorists. But because I was driving, I couldn't exactly take notes or photos or videos. And so I used the audio recorder on my cell phone to take notes. And then the final method of recording observations is through the field notes. And so these are literally just written notes where you write down what you see. There's two things that you want to include in your field notes. One is what you know, okay, so this is what you actually observe. And then the other is what you think. And so this is your interpretation of what you have observed. For example, I did just a brief paper a few years back where I was observing students at the student union and how they interacted with people that were basically trying to hand them flyers or get them to sign a petition or something. And so I was writing about how students interacted with these people in terms of whether they went and talked to them or whether they just kind of walked on by or whether they ignored them entirely. I noticed a lot of people, it seemed like they would see these folks and then they would bust out their cell phone and maybe use that as an excuse to kind of walk by. And so I wrote in my notes, I see a lot of people pulling out their cell phones. I think what they're doing is they're using this as an avoidance tactic. So as you can see, that's an example of using field notes where I wrote down what I saw and then my interpretation of that behavior. Some things you want to keep in mind when taking field notes: don't trust your memory. Write down things when you see them immediately. If you think, okay, I'll write my field notes up in a few hours after I leave, you'll probably forget a lot. Take your notes in stages. So, a good idea is just to maybe jot down some initial thoughts, and then later on, you can go back and fill in the detail. And then, obviously, try to record as much as possible. And this can be challenging. Another way that you can collect data in the field is through an environmental survey. And this is where you start out with a survey or other instrument that you've created beforehand. And then you go out and you fill in your observations. This is very much how I conducted the study in Winter Park. So I had the environmental survey. I knew what factors I was looking for that might lead to residential burglary, and then I wrote that up when I was out in the field. So, anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for field research. You can read more about it in chapter 11. But again, just to recap, field research is good about observing things that are best studied in their natural environment. We talked about some of the roles that a researcher can take. So, the full participant role, where they're actually getting involved in whatever it is that they're studying. The observer as participant role, where they're observing and people know that they're a researcher, and the complete observer role, where they're just observing. And we talked about some of the ethical problems with these roles. We also talked about how you can record observations in the field, right? So through the use of photos and videos, audio recording, your field notes, and then also the environmental survey. So that pretty much wraps it up for field research. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email and I would be happy to address them.